Well, I think there's a number of big ideas in the book, but I think the core idea is that we have to pay attention to our habits and our uses of technology, just like anything that has the potential to impact us in a negative way. Moderation is the key, right? So I'm not saying, you should never use technology. That'd be impossible in today's world. But what I am saying is that there's a difference between doom scrolling on social media for hours on end because you're lonely and you're looking for some validation or some reinforcement, and using social media to share an experience you had with some other friends or setting up a face-to-face social interaction. Those are two very different uses of the exact same platform. And when I'm trying to encourage people in the book, and I make 10 recommendations in the book of how we can protect our brain in the digital age, one of them is to seek out face-to-face social interactions because that's what we're wired for. It's what stimulates us, and it's what helps us boost our spirits and protects us against anxiety and depression. So we know from research that the more social media platforms you're on, for example, the more likely you are to suffer from anxiety and depression. We also know that children before the age of 3, for each hour of media they consume per day, their risk of ADHD at age 7 goes up 10%. We also know that we're living in an epidemic of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. I saw a statistic the other day that 60%, 60% of college age students in the United States meet the criteria for a mental illness. That is an enormous statistic. And it's up threefold at least from 10, 15 years ago. So the consequences are pretty significant. There are other consequences too, besides loneliness, anxiety, and depression. We know that when you look at death per mile and accidents per mile driving, that over the last 40 years, death per mile actually was going down. We had anti-lock brakes, we had um, airbags, we had sensors on cars and better lighting on roads and better signage. And we saw this steady decrease in deaths per mile and increase in highway safety until 2016, which is right around the time when smartphones were peaking, and it started to go up. And it ticked up for the next several years because people were more distracted than ever in their car. So one of the consequences of these habits is actually dying. And you've probably seen, if you live in a busy city, people crossing the street with their phone in their hands, not looking at traffic, and drivers sitting looking at their phone. And that's a really high risk behavior, and we have to be cognizant of it. Now, I'm sympathetic to people, sitting in their cars, bored driving and wanting to look at their phone. And one of the things I remind people of is the habits we develop in one environment sometimes translate into another one. In other words, if you're a high multitasker and you're constantly checking your phone in your living room, there's a high chance you're going to do the same thing in your car. And you have to be really, really careful and cognizant of that. I think one of the big takeaways in the book, and maybe one of the surprising findings, is the focus on media multitasking and multitasking in general. It's something we all do, and that it really has a dramatic impact on productivity. So increase error rate, decrease processing speed, as I mentioned before. But also over time, it starts to fatigue the prefrontal cortex, which then means emotion regulation, sustained attention, memory, all becomes impacted. And that's really a critical thing. And we now know what the mechanism in the brain is regarding multitasking. So modern neuroscience was debating whether the decrease in productivity from multitasking was a consequence of trying to recruit parts of the brain to do a task they weren't meant to do. So, for example, if you go back to the symphony orchestra metaphor, was the percussion section trying to play parts that the brass section was meant to do? Was the visual cortex trying to do something that the auditory cortex was meant to do? Or was it really just a bottleneck situation, meaning multitasking is try to put too much information into the same attentional funnel than it can handle. And it turns out to be the latter, right? So what studies have shown is that when we're multitasking, we're really trying to put too much information through our attentional funnel, and that's why things slow down and we make more mistakes. And I try to remind people, we've all had the experience of being tired or being hangry, right? Hungry and our glucose is down, and we can't focus on tasks as the same way as when we're well rested and well fed. Well, that's your attentional funnel, your attentional span decreasing. So we know we have a limited attention span. And so trying to put too much information through that shouldn't surprise us that we end up with some of the impacts we're discussing, which is increased error rate, decreased processing time. And so that's really something I think people have latched onto, and it makes you think about your behavior. Because again, we all do it. We just need to be more mindful about when we're doing it. What's the task we're trying to accomplish, and what are we really gaining by trying to do two things at once? So in the book, I went through 10 recommendations that are based on neuroscience and science in general, that are informed by research, that we can all think about using in various ways to protect our brain in the digital age. And so one of them, of course, we're talking about multitasking, is to do less media multitasking and do less multitasking in general. Really try to focus on monotasking. Set yourself either a timer, or I try to use my calendar to set appointments for monotasking. I'm just going to check email for a half hour, and then I'm going to work on a particular project for an hour, and really try not to get disrupted by other tasks. Another recommendation, we haven't talked about FOMO, the fear of missing out, which drives a lot of the habits, particularly around social media. Well, I talk about celebrating JOMO, the joy of missing out, and that there is a lot of things in this world beyond looking at our phones that are full of rich, emotional, rewarding experience. Walking in nature and seeing friends and being with friends is really just two examples of that. Um, Another thing I talk about in the book, particularly for adolescents, but I think it's true for adults too, is to be very careful about your identity online. And what I mean by that is that when we're growing up, particularly in the adolescent years, there's really two questions adolescents are trying to answer: who am I, and how do I fit in? And so being on multiple social media platforms and presenting yourself as a different person can be very confusing and very precarious, and can have real impact. So, what I do, and I recommend others, is I'm only on LinkedIn from a social media perspective. I present my business and professional self there, and there's no confusion about who I am and what I stand for, including posting things about the book. And I worry, and there's been some research on this, as people try to play with different identities online, it can be very confusing for people growing up. Another recommendation I talk about is choosing paper over pixels. So what does that mean? Um, we know from research that reading something on paper, you retain more and you learn more than reading the same information on a screen. Well, why is that? Well, when we're looking at a computer, our eyes are constantly adjusting to the light and the distance. We also don't have what is called haptic feedback, which is the turning of the page, which, believe it or not, shows progression and gives us a sense for progress. We also know that the blue light associated with the modern computer screen can be fatiguing, and can actually sort of wear down people's thinking over time. And so we're seeing a trend in college and people who are really doing deep thinking, using and buying more books to do that work. And I think that's another clear recommendation that comes from the book. Because if we move to the language of addiction, which I'm very careful in the book to make a distinction between habits and addiction, and it can be a fine line. The biggest difference is when you want to quit, it's much harder with an addiction. And there are some neurobiological differences between habit and addiction, particularly as it relates to the prefrontal cortex. In a severe addiction, the prefrontal cortex pretty much shuts down, and the reward centers are driving our behavior. Whereas with habits, we still have the monitoring capability of our prefrontal cortex and allows us to intervene. So the best way to avoid unhealthy habits is to not start them. And so that starts with parenting and young children and waiting long enough period of time before introducing smartphones and having schools and promoting schools that take phones away when they show up in the morning and give it back only at night, and being strategic about feature phones, meaning just dumb phones that have just voice and text. You don't need a supercomputer in your pocket, more powerful than put a man on the moon in the 1969 for every child connected to the internet and everything that offers, good and bad. I talk about in the book that in 1908, a different technology was introduced in Detroit, and it was the Model T, the Ford motor car. And Detroit became a test bed for a lot of people having an automobile at a time when horse and buggies dominated. And to put this in perspective, a Model T, when it rolled off the assembly line, cost about $3,000 of today's dollars. So it was very affordable. Um, and the first few years were a disaster. There were no rules of the road. There were no ability to sort of manage these powerful vehicles, and a lot of people died, and there was a lot of chaos. It took 10 years before the first stop sign was put in place. It was another 3 years before the patent for the stoplight was issued. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we went on a multi-decade, almost a 100-year journey of safety, improved highway safety, and decreases in death per mile until 2016 and the smartphone came along. My point is, powerful technologies often take time for society to adjust to. So, in addition to us managing our own habits, we really do need government and schools, parents, educators, politicians, to work together to try to put some guideposts, some stop signs on the information superhighway and around these technologies, including social media companies. Now, you might be aware there was recently two cases, one in Arizona and one in California, around Meta and Google, related to social media contributing to very serious health consequences for young people. And both juries found those companies guilty. So I think another potential opportunity, besides us all becoming more aware, is using the courts and tragically very bad situations for young people as examples of how we need to do a better job. I think it's really important that people find their own path here, because it's not a one size fits all situation. I'll tell you a story. I had an intern a couple years ago, and she was helping me with some of the book promotion and some other work for one of my companies. And she got inspired by the book, and she said, I tried this little trick, and it was really very powerful." I said, "Well, what did you do?" She said, "I turned my phone into black and white mode." I said, "Really? Tell me about that." She said, "Yeah, I found that it was just less interesting when everything was in black and white, and I spent less time on it." And she had measured that, using the iPhone app. So I think that's just a wonderful example of a kind of simple thing that someone can do and really change their habits. One thing I try to do as a parent is I'm very careful not to be on my phone in front of my children. If I do have a phone call, or if I have to text or email someone on my phone when I'm with them, I will step out of the room because I don't want to see my kids. I don't want my because I don't want my kids to see me on my phone all the time, because they really mirror a lot of parental behavior. So we have to remember that we are role models for our children, at least for a period of time, and can send powerful signals by our own behavior. So sometimes I find when I'm talking about my book, parents of young children are the most receptive, because that's the point where you really can make an intervention.